For today's video, I was fortunate enough to be able to get my hands on one of the last Toyota 86s in the press fleet. The Toyota 86 is, I think, one of the most misunderstood vehicles in Toyota's lineup, so I think it's critical to take a look at this and talk about what the Toyota 86 is and what it is not before we see an all-new generation of Toyota 86 coming probably sometime next year. We don't know exact details about when the next generation 86 is going to happen, but we do know that theoretically orders are not being taken anymore for the Toyota 86, and this generation will end production sometime this fall, so only in about a few months from now. The 86 dates back to 2012. Of course, in North America at that time, this was labeled as the Scion FRS. Scion was Toyota's youth-oriented brand that didn't really go where they wanted it to go, but when they dissolved Scion, they decided to keep many of their models and incorporate them into the rest of the Toyota lineup, so they decided to call this the Toyota 86 because that's what it was always known as in Japan. Since 2012, there has also been a sister ship to this in the Subaru BRZ. If you didn't know it by now, Toyota owns a minority share of Subaru, and the two companies have teamed up for different projects in the past. One of them is the 86, the BRZ, and the FRS. The Subaru connection is definitely noticeable from the front because we have this incredibly low front end. That's made possible by the horizontally opposed engine that we find under this hood, which was a Subaru design initially, but has had some Toyota modifications to it. If this had a more traditional inline engine, like we find under the hood of an MX-5 or a BMW coupe or a convertible, you would find that the hood would be much higher. Back in 2012, I was fortunate enough to attend the original launch event in North America for the Scion FRS. And I'm really glad I did, because if I hadn't been to that event, which was held at a very small track in Arizona, then I probably wouldn't understand what the 86 is all about. You see, some people want to compare this to a Mazda MX-5 or perhaps a Volkswagen GTI, but in many ways, the GTI comparison is a little bit more apt than the MX-5. You see, the MX-5 is certainly a practical, daily driver, livable vehicle, but it's most frequently purchased by people as a second, third, fourth car, more of a weekend fun car. It's a top-down vehicle. You can get a hard top or a soft top. This is a hardtop vehicle only, but it's also a four-seater, not a two-seater, so it is a bit more practical. This was designed for the kind of person that has just one car and wants to be able to do their daily commuting in it, their grocery shopping in it, their weekend away in it, so we have a bigger trunk in the back. Although clearly a very tight squeeze, it is possible theoretically to put child seats in here. But on the weekends, you can take that child seat out and you can take this out on small tracks, out on your favorite autocross course, etc. The added practicality of the back seat means that this is larger than an MX-5, about a foot longer at 166 inches long, but this is still considerably smaller and considerably lighter weight than many of the two-door vehicles that were on sale back in 2012 when it launched. So if you want something that's definitely small and nimble, this is going to be the ticket rather than something like a Ford Mustang or a Chevy Camaro or certainly something like a Dodge Challenger. It's a very different kind of vehicle. Joking aside, this really was designed to be baby's first track car, and it's obvious when we take a look at the tires here. These are sometimes derided as being Prius tires. These are Michelin Primacy HP tires. They're not especially grippy, and they're not especially wide. We get 215 width tires in the US, 205 width tires in other world markets where this may be sold. The reason we get relatively skinny tires and we don't have high grip tires is that this is designed to be the kind of vehicle where you can get the rear end to kick out with just about 200 horsepower under the hood. If we had really wide, meaty tires on this, then you wouldn't be able to experience those rear-wheel drive dynamics at lower speeds like you can in the 86. So when thinking about the 86, it's important to keep your expectations in check and, of course, understand what the vehicle was designed for from the very beginning. This was designed to be the kind of vehicle where if you want to explore rear-wheel drive dynamics, say you've owned something like a Toyota Corolla before, or perhaps even a Volkswagen GTI, which is certainly a direct competitor to this. In a similar sort of way, the GTI is also designed to be that weekend fun car that's practical for daily driving, but it's a front-wheel drive car, and if you wanted to go from that to something like this, and you wanted to explore rear-wheel drive dynamics out on an autocross course or a small track, you can get the rear end to kick out at much lower speeds. That's what this is all about, where it's going to be a lot safer. And then from here, you could graduate up into something like a Toyota Supra if you wanted to have that same kind of fun at higher speeds. And that simply wouldn't be possible if they had chosen wide, grippy tires. Moving to the rear, we have a small spoiler on top of a pretty accommodating trunk. This is one of the more practical touches in here versus something like the MX-5. Remember that this is bigger than the Mazda, and of course it was not designed to be a convertible or a roadster. And that's why we can get a bigger trunk, because we don't have to have anywhere for a top to go. Although there are clearly larger trunks out there, I was able to fit two of our 24-inch roller bags back here, and the trunk hinges don't impact cargo space, which is a nice touch. We also have a compact spare tire under the load floor, which is certainly a rarity today. After a little bit of research, I discovered that the Alex & Auto's exclusive trunk comfort index first debuted in the Scion FRS all those years ago. And even though, like, the FRS was replaced with the 86 and the trunk comfort index was replaced with our active safety segment, I decided to go ahead and include it here in the 86. We don't have any handles to help you close the trunk lid, but because of the size of this cargo area, I'm going to go ahead and give this 5 out of 10 points. Under the hood, we have a lot of Subaru and a little bit of Toyota going on. That's why we find both logos on this 2-liter Boxer engine. Essentially what happened here is Subaru and Toyota took a 2-liter Subaru Boxer engine and then they grafted on Toyota's direct injection technology. I'm a little bit surprised that no other Subaru has ended up with D4S. This is the only one. Under the hood, we find a little bit of Toyota and a whole lot of Subaru going on here. Essentially what the two companies did was they took a 2-liter Boxer engine from the Subaru lineup and they grafted on Toyota's D4S direct injection technology. That allows this engine to produce 205 horsepower and 156 pound-feet of torque if you choose the manual transmission. If you choose the automatic transmission, which is what we're driving today, that drops down to 200 horsepower and 151 pound-feet of torque. I have to admit, I've never spent much time in the 86 with an automatic transmission, so I have been a little interested to see how that differs from the manual, which I've driven many times before. Interestingly enough, this automatic transmission is essentially a reworked version of the same automatic that we found behind the smaller V6 engine in the IS250. As I said before, the Boxer engine was really essential to the design of the 86 because the top of the engine ends up right about here in the vehicle. What you're seeing above that are the intake runners, the accessories like the alternator, etc., but the actual top of the cylinders is right about here. That gives us a really low weight balance. It also means that the engine is very compact vertically, allowing the front end to be a little bit lower. Now, Boxer engine designs can generally be a little bit heavier than inline engine designs, but that weight is slung lower in the vehicle, giving it a lower center of gravity. I give front seat comfort 7 out of 10 points. I find these seats more comfortable than the ones that we find in the MX-5, and it's worth noting that if you're a taller person, there's a little bit more room in here. So we find a little bit more headroom. The seat's all the way down, but I could recline the seat a bit more and get a little bit more headroom if I had a longer torso. And there's a reasonable amount of legroom as well. A common complaint about the MX-5 is that the front seats don't move quite far enough rearward, of course, because there's that huge bulkhead right behind the seats. The one thing I wish they would add to this seat design is an adjustable lumbar support, even if it was a manual design. But as it is, these seats are a little bit more comfortable for longer road trips than the MX-5. Certainly something to keep in mind is that the seating position in here is really, really low. It feels like I'm practically on the ground, and the opening is pretty narrow as well. So you definitely have to duck in and then dip down to get out. The rear seats are not huge, but still very logically a selling point for this over something like the MX-5. Now, legroom is pretty tight, but if I had to, I would be able to sit up front. I tried this a little bit earlier. I would be able to sit just barely in that front seat and then sit right back here behind the passenger seat. Now, a lot more difficult to do that over there on the driver's side because the pedals, the steering wheel, etc., I would need to be a little bit further back. I probably could not sit behind myself. But even so, fitting 3 people in here is one more than you'll be able to fit in an MX-5. Clearly, however, something like a Volkswagen GTI is going to be more practical in the back. Though logically, rear-facing child seats would be pretty tricky to accommodate back here, forward-facing child seats for older children or booster seats really shouldn't be a problem. On the inside, you can see that we have this sort of double bump shaped ceiling right here. Those are dish-ins for the driver and front passengers' heads. The driver and front passenger have fixed height shoulder belts, 2-way adjustable headrests, and as you can see, these seats feature very aggressive bolstering in the shoulder area, in the hip area, and the thigh area right there. These are definitely very aggressive seats. Moving over to the front door panels, there's a decent percentage of hard plastic going on here, just as you'd expect in an inexpensive vehicle. On the top of the door, there's an imitation suede insert. There's a perforated soft touch section right there in the middle of the door, right around that soft touch armrest. And then there's a little soft area right there for you to rest your knee against. The interior design certainly harkens from a different era in here. Remember, this started out as a Scion, and that's why we find this particular infotainment system in the center of the dashboard. This is not one of the same infotainment systems that we find in other Toyota models. That's because in the original Scion lineup, it was designed to accommodate a lot of aftermarket stereos, so you could more easily upgrade it yourself. And that's why we find this unit in here that really has no software resemblance to any other Toyota model. For 2020, this does, however, get Apple CarPlay and Android Auto, but I suspect a lot of folks may want to swap this out with their own head unit later. Down below that, we have dual zone automatic climate control. This is a bit of an upgrade from some other performance affordable vehicles out there that may only have single zone climate control. We have the engine start stop button right down there. Pretty traditional console shifter right down here. Remember, we are in the automatic transmission version. Of course, there'd be a manual shifter if they got the manual version. Handbrake right here, sport mode, snow mode. We have a stability and traction control button there with a track mode option, and then a traction disable button right there. The controls for the 2 front heated seats. There's a padded armrest between the driver and front passenger seat that slides out of the way to reveal these removable cup holders, and a moderately sized storage bin. There's also a 12-volt power port in there. On the driver's side, we have an analog instrument cluster. I have the car off right now because boxer engines tend to be a little bit rougher at idle than inline engines, and so it tends to make the camera vibrate around a bit. You can see that the multifunction LCD not only gives us our trip computer readouts, but we get a little bit of additional gauge information. This again has very little resemblance to anything else that we see in the Toyota lineup, but we have some similar features here, including G meters right there, and for some reason a static readout of the horsepower and torque curve for the engine. We can also adjust some of the settings right here in this display. The first thing to know out on the road is that the automatic transmission is going to be a lot slower 0 to 60 than the manual transmission, about a full second. This model ran 0 to 60 in 7.5 seconds, and the fastest time I was ever able to get with the manual transmission model is 6.5. And I'm not the world's fastest manual transmission shifter because I prefer not to roast the clutch. Now, on the other hand, getting good launches with the automatic transmission are going to be a little bit easier because it is pretty easy to bog down this engine. One of the complaints about this 2-liter boxer is that starts are a little bit tricky and that it does lack a little bit of mid-level torque. You'll really see that in the torque curve of the engine. The other complaint is that this engine can sound a little unrefined. You can definitely hear that we get a lot of engine noise into the cabin, and it certainly doesn't sound as smooth as, for instance, the 4-cylinder version of the Toyota Supra, or, for instance, the 4-cylinder engine that we find under the hood of the Volkswagen GTI or the Mazda MX-5. Now, personally, I think it's a bit of a personal preference on the way the engine sounds, but you will notice that this is not going to idle as smoothly as something like the MX-5. In our 60 to 0 braking test, it took 114 feet for this model to stop from 60 miles an hour back to 0, which is a little bit longer than some of the alternatives out there, but still a respectable stopping distance. Remember that we do have 215 with tires on this particular model, and those are going to be a little bit narrower than some of the things that you might want to cross-shop this with. I commented on the tire section a little bit earlier, but it's important to remember the curb weight. Even with the tires that we have on this model, skid pad numbers are still very good. We don't have access to a skid pad here at Alex Autos, but publications that do have put this at around 0.9 Gs, which is absolutely excellent, even though we have efficiency-focused 215 with tires. That's because of the low curb weight and the low center of gravity, also an excellently designed suspension. When it comes to the handling score, I'm certainly going to give this an A. You will find grippier options out there, absolutely no question, and if you wanted to improve road holding, you could logically put some grippy summer tires on the model that we're driving right here. But again, absolute grip is not what this vehicle is all about. It's about precision. The steering is absolutely excellent. We don't get quite as much feedback from the front tires as we find in the MX-5, but the steering in here is incredibly precise. This goes exactly where you point it. And again, thanks to the tire choice, if you do want the rear tires to step out on you, you can get that to happen with just 200 horsepower under the hood. There's certainly an argument to be made for a well-balanced performance vehicle, and that's exactly the mission of the Toyota 86. We see something similar in some of Lexus's performance vehicles, where they haven't opted for the most horsepower or the most amount of grip. Instead, they were targeting balanced levels of power and grip. That's exactly what we see in here. We also see similar commentary from Mazda, for instance, in the MX-5, where they have resisted putting extra power under the hood because they think that that would add too much weight. They think that it would go against the mission of the MX-5. Very similar answer from Toyota about why we don't have an 86 with a turbocharger or a supercharger on it. Out on a rougher road like the one that we're on now, you'll certainly notice the difference in suspension tuning between this and something like the MX-5 or, of course, the Fiat Spider. Those vehicles are significantly softer than this, even in the firmest version available from the factory. That suspension softness is not just obvious out on rougher roads like this, but also out on the paved road, where we definitely have more tip and dive and more body roll than we find in this. That's because Mazda had a different target for the MX-5. They were trying to imitate the classic British Roadster, which also has a relatively soft suspension, but very light curb weight. And remember that this is several hundred pounds heavier than the MX-5. So the MX-5 can afford to have a softer suspension because it's very light. The downside to the lightweight mission of the 86 is certainly noise isolation. We get 74 decibels in here at 50 miles an hour. This cabin is just not as isolated as something like a Camaro or a Mustang would be, but remember, they're going to be bigger and heavier. One of the advantages to the automatic transmission is fuel economy. This is EPA rated for 27 miles per gallon, a notable bump over the 24 miles per gallon for the manual transmission. Unfortunately, again, it's not going to be as quick. Over a week of mixed driving, we've been averaging 26.2 miles per gallon, which is definitely a little bit above what you should get with the manual transmission. Bottom lining the 86 out on the road is pretty easy. Again, I think this is a little misunderstood because some people out there expect it to have absolutely mind-blowing grip. Grip is certainly good, it's just not that next level where some people assume it might be. If you want that next level of grip or that next level in performance, Toyota would of course love to sell you a Supra. And the Supra's existence is one of the reasons that the next generation 86 is unlikely to get too far from the same formula that we find in here. Now personally, I don't have a problem with that at all, but be sure and let me know what you think about that in the comment section. Before we move into the pricing section, I'd like to remind all of you to go ahead and hit that notification bell icon down there just under this video, and be sure and turn on all notifications. Even if you're subscribed, you won't get notified about our new videos unless that bell icon is on. For the last model year in this generation of the 86, pricing starts at $27,060. And the pricing range is relatively narrow because, as the Scion that came before it, there really aren't very many options available. That puts this notably below the Toyota Supra, which starts just under $43,000. Now let's be honest, the Toyota 86 is a pretty hard sell, and that's why we're not going to do our usual comparison section here. It's not because the Toyota 86 is intrinsically bad, but because it's often misunderstood, and even shoppers out there that truly understand the mission of the Toyota 86 seem to buy something else. The engineers focus on purity, the balance of power to handling that we find in the Toyota 86 that makes it the excellent baby's first track car, means that it's just not the same kind of untamed fun that you could get for $30,000 in a wide variety of sort of competition, from a Ford Mustang, which is unquestionably larger, to something along the lines of a Veloster N, which is a front-wheel drive hatchback, or of course, the benchmark fun hatchback, the Volkswagen GTI. All of which can logically be considered to be direct competition to the Toyota 86. These are all the kind of vehicles that you can daily drive, but you can also take to a track or an autocross course or some other fun winding mountain road when you want to on the weekend. And of course, if you wanted to go topless, there's always that Mazda Miata. Now, what makes this trickier is that even though some people may be buying their 86 or their GTI or their Veloster N for those weekend track days or those weekend autocross courses, most shoppers don't end up actually doing that on a regular basis. Instead, they want a car that's a great daily driver and is a lot of fun on a winding mountain road or out on a highway or in the stoplight races, whatever you're doing with your fun performance car. And in a lot of those situations, there are just better alternatives to the Toyota 86, like the Mustang EcoBoost. It's going to be faster 0 to 60. If it sounds like I'm being harsh on the 86, perhaps I am a little bit, but I don't really mean to be, because I love the fact that the 86 exists, and I love the fact that Toyota is going to give it another try. We are going to be getting a second generation 86 very soon. But the calculus of that next generation 86 is not really going to be different than the one that we drove today. That's because of the Toyota Supra. Starting at around $43,000 with the base 2-liter turbocharged engine, they can't really make the 86 300 or 400 horsepower. It just wouldn't fit in their sports car lineup. So the 86 is going to remain baby's first track car. And as a result, the 86 is probably always going to live a little bit in the shadow of the Supra. But I still love the fact that the 86 exists. Again, if you want to buy a vehicle that has rear-wheel drive dynamics, and you can experience those fun rear-wheel drive dynamics on an autocross course at lower speeds than you would be taking in your Supra out on Laguna Seca, for instance, at a lower, less risky speed, then that is exactly what the 86 is about. In some ways, that mission makes it less fun out on the open road than something like a Ford Mustang, but it really is sticking much truer to its original mission than many of its direct competitors out there. Let me know what you think about all that down there in the comment section. And if you were shopping in this segment and had about $30,000 to spend on your next fun vehicle, what would you buy? I suspect, frankly, I would just get a Ford Mustang. This generation of the Mustang, thanks to its new rear suspension design, really does drive like a discount German luxury coupe. Now, obviously, it's not going to have the same sort of luxury feel on the inside that we find in the Germans, but even though it looks sort of like a Lego blew up inside the Ford Mustang, the interior doesn't really feel that much lower rent than the Toyota 86, and it may even be a little bit less expensive. Let me know what you think about that down there. Be sure and find us over at Facebook, over at Twitter, Instagram, all those other social places. If you haven't hit that notification bell down there below the screen, be sure and do that right now. Make sure all of your notifications are on, and I'll see all of you next week.